I think we'll be doing the 7th chapter for, I don't know, a long time. It's probably 10 classes so far. So yeah, the 7th chapter, it's a long chapter. Just keeps it's got a lot to say. So that's what we're going on right now. We're in chapter 7. We're going to start with verse number 24. Okay, verse number 24, chapter 7, verse number 24. And I will share the screen with everybody. There's that. Okay. Press the button there. Okay. And we've been in this series of verses where he's really starting to get to, I think, the point of what he's talking about over here. Hope everyone can see that. The point that we're getting into, the main point that we're talking about, is this idea of he's trying to find the ultimate source of wisdom. Where do we find wisdom, the source of all wisdom? And he really runs into a big problem there. Because, and this is what he gets into a lot, is that it turns out that there's a lot of wisdom that is subjective and not objective. If you want pure wisdom, if you want to go to the source of wisdom, he said earlier, then you have to go to things that are objective truths. Things that are natural, that are you can't deny their existence. Which we spoke about as looking at math or science or things like that. Or from another perspective, the ultimate truth is would go to God, right? Hashem providing us with ultimate truth, or the Torah, and that would provide us with the ultimate truth. And that's something that you can't debate necessarily, okay? And so that would be objective truth. Now, there you're going to have, there's a possibility for information, for knowledge, for chachma, for wisdom to be an accessible thing. But then there turns out to be a lot of other things that are subjective. And that's what he's been talking about for a while. And we discussed last week, I'm just going to scroll up a little bit over here so we can look at this last verse. And he said that when we are evaluating information that comes to us, when we're evaluating wisdom as we are taught it, we have to kind of understand, first of all, what's the source? Is the source from people who are smarter than us, who have more to offer than us? Or is it a source from people who are not as helpful as we are? Are we getting influenced by lower standards, I would say. And he didn't say either of those were correct or incorrect. He in fact, he was very careful about bringing caveats onto all those. Even if somebody smarter than you tells you something, doesn't mean it's true. Even if somebody who's lower than you tells you something, it doesn't mean it's not true, right? He just said you have to be first gauge where it's coming from, and that will help you figure out where you should go with it. Okay, and then when he talked about in verse number 23 was he says, I decided that I'm going to become wisdom itself. I will become, I'm looking everywhere and I can't find any specific source, any identifiable source that is the epitome of wisdom. So I'm going to be that. And he says, it turns out it's much farther from me than I realized, right? And that was that last word, v'hi mimeni. It is distant from me, okay? We discussed last week also where the sages understand that this verse is referring to the mystery of the red heifer that was difficult for King Solomon to understand and impossible for King Solomon to understand. Specifically the point that the red heifer, which is a process of purifying people from contact with a dead body, right? If somebody comes into contact with a dead body, they need to be purified before they can enter the temple, or another number of other activities, but that's the primary one, right? So in order to be purified, they would have to go through this process of having the ashes of the paraduma, of the red heifer, being sprinkled on them. And there's this paradox that the person who gets the ashes sprinkled on them, they become purified. But anybody else who touches the ashes becomes contaminated and actually has to go to the mikvah before they enter the temple. So that's been a point of confusion and lack of understanding since the mitzvah was given, since the command was given. The only person ever who was gifted with the knowledge of understanding that was Moses himself. King Solomon, the wisest of all people, was not did not merit to have that information. And so we understand, the sages tell us that that's what he's referring to in this verse, or one of the things he's referring to in this verse over here, is he says, I attempted to find wisdom, and I found that it was distant from me, that I was unable to access this peace. And we kind of, I interpreted that last week because when we're dealing with looking at other people for wisdom, we say, we'll subscribe to one philosophy. We'll say, this has to be correct. I know this person, I trust this person, they're right. And then you find out that there's something under the surface that's not so good. Or the opposite. You have somebody that you've written off in your books. You say, this person or this source, I can't believe anything that they say. Half the country thinks that about the New York Times, half the country thinks that about Fox News, so anything that they say is garbage. And maybe there's something right there. It turns out that something that was tameh, that was contaminated, through the mystery becomes pure. And something that was pure, it turns out to be contaminated. So that's his kind of idea that he's talking about, is when we're looking to leaders, when we're looking to a source of wisdom, it's impossible to say, I subscribe to this person, this philosophy, and that's it. I'm done. I could check out now. Right? That's not how wisdom works, because even the greatest minds will be tainted by something, will be lacking something. We live in a world of imperfect people. I was actually just talking to my wife about this tonight, because we were talking about a specific situation that came up, and we were talking about the idea that they say you should never meet your heroes, because your heroes, they occupy a certain space in your mind, in your own legends that you build in your head. And when you meet them, you find out that they're people, they're flawed. It has its own it can have a negative ramification. At the same time, perhaps it's a good thing to meet your heroes and find out that they're not perfect, and that's almost a lesson in of itself. But anyway, that's kind of a side thing that just kind of occurred to me tonight. We were talking about it, and so that was our verse last week. And as we were closing out the class, Jacob asked, is there a significance to this term rachokah, that he says that wisdom is distant from you? Why that term distant? Why not any other term? So it's a great question, and you can see already in our verse this week that it's gonna have to be explained. So let's take a look at this week's verse, and maybe that will make some things a little clearer. Okay, again, this is chapter 7, verse 24. And he says, Rachok ma shehaya. That which was is distant. Okay, it is distant, that which was. Hebrew syntax flips it around, right? So Rachok ma shehaya. That which was is distant. The amok, and something that is very deep, mi yimtza'enu, who can find it? Okay, let's read that one more time. Rachok ma shehaya. That which was is distant. The amok, mi yimtza'enu. And that which is very deep, who can find that? Who can find that which is very deep? Okay, this doubling of the term amok, that is a common use in the biblical Hebrew. We'll find that when we double up a term, it's to create emphasis. So something that's very deep. Okay, you could say amok ma'od, but they don't. In biblical Hebrew, it tends to be they double up a term to emphasize its emphasis. So that's that idea over there. That's the wording over there. And so we find out right off the bat, kind of hinting to what Jacob was asking, is that there's two terms being used here. There's rachok, which is distant, and amok, which is deep. Okay, something that's deep down, or deep in your mind, or so I was kind of trying to think about this. I didn't see much in the commentaries specifically about what the difference is between the two of them. But I was just kind of imagining, when we imagine something that's distant. So, for example, the Torah tells us that if you want to experience repentance, the person wants to experience teshuvah, wants to access that process, the Torah tells us, Lo bashamayim hi, lo rechokahi. It is not distant from you. It's right there. It's not in heaven. It's not over the seas. It's not anywhere else. It's right in front of you, right? So the Torah tells us that. That's near the end of Deuteronomy, near the end of Moses' life. He tells us that the possibility of doing repentance is not far from you. It's not all the way over there. And that seems to be what we're going with, is that rachok is a physical distance. So I'm here, and that's all the way over there. It's a lack of access. And so when you say something is not far, it means that I don't lack access. Another kind of way we could see this is we talk about in the times of the temple, everyone had a mitzvah. There was an opportunity everyone had to go and have the paschal sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, which was done on the afternoon of the day before Pesach, and then you would the day before Passover, and then you would enjoy it at the Passover Seder. And it says that if somebody is rachok, is distant from Jerusalem, then you are able to push it off until the next month. On the 14th day of Iyar, you would do it instead of the 14th day of Nisan. And the Talmud tells us that when it says that a person is distant, it's actually not even physical distance. The Talmud tells us that a person could be at the foot of the mountain. They just don't have the ability to get up the mountain to bring the sacrifice. Right? The temple was on the top of a hill, a pretty small hill, relatively small hill. So if a person was not able, lacked the physical ability to go up the mountain, that was already considered distant, and therefore they were able to, if they needed to, they could push it off till the second, what we call Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach, the second Passover, on the 14th day of the month of Iyar, 1 month after Pesach, after Passover. So we find that rachok seems to indicate a lack of access, right? It's something that's distant from me, meaning that I don't have the access to that thing. Then you think about depth, and depth is a little different. You could have something that's right in your property that's very deep. People used to have wells. Well went deep down into the ground. That's actually, you think about depth, you think about a well. I don't know, my mind connects the two things, very closely. I think about it. Amok, the term amok, I immediately, the picture in my brain is a well. And a well is in your property. It's not physically distant, but it is a deep thing. So it's kind of something that's in your wheelhouse, but it requires some level of, some tool to access it. In the case of a well, you need a bucket. You need something, or a pump or something. You need something to draw something from the depths. So rachok, again, distance, far away, that's a lack of access, as opposed to depth shows, or it kind of hints to you have all the access, you lack the tools to go through with it. Yeah. So he seems to be referring to two different types of knowledge, two different types of wisdom. One wisdom is physically distant from a person. Another wisdom is in your house. It's in your property, but you lack the tools to plumb the depths of that wisdom. So that seems to be two different things we're talking about. Now, we have to identify what are those two different types of wisdom. What are those two things? But before I get into that, I just kind of thought it was interesting because there's a lot of we talk a lot in the 21st century. We talk a lot about privilege, or who has access to information. It's a common topic of discussion because there are communities, there are areas that perhaps lack the ability to access knowledge. There's in sociology, they talk about gatekeepers, people who block the sources of knowledge and don't allow you to come in unless you have certain prerequisites. In some ways, the college system is like that, right? They don't want you to go and access the information unless you fit their bill, whether that's pay their bill or whether that's fit their type of student. So in one sense, we have a lot of knowledge that's gate kept. I guess that was how you would say it. It's kept away from people because there's people who want to control that information. Then you have another aspect of our lives nowadays, which is that we have the internet. The internet is full of information. Some argue that you never have to really go to college nowadays because anything you want to know, you can find on the internet. But we also know that there's pitfalls there. That if a person just has access to all that information, it's not necessarily a good thing. You have to have the tools to know how to access that. Right? I don't know about you. I've definitely had the experience where I wasn't feeling well or something, and so you immediately Google what are my symptoms, and you find out that, well, it could be anything from a cold to COVID to, who knows what. And it's something that doctors are constantly trying to fight people to stop doing, to stop Googling your symptoms, right? Because we have so much access to information. It's not rachok, it's not distant, but it is amok. It is deep. You have to know the tools. You have to have the tools to learn how to use that information. If a person just has a big book of symptoms, or a big book of in the mental health, they have the DSM-5, right, which is the handbook, the manual of all the mental illnesses that could possibly show up, that we have listed, that we know of. All right, so that if somebody just flips through that and decides, okay, I'm OCD and the schizophrenic, and you can come up with all sorts of self-diagnoses. That's something that's not rachok. You have the book, you have all the information. No one's stopping you from looking at it, but it is amok. It is deep. Sorry, not it is deep. It's amok, miyim sa'anu. So that seems to be these two categories of information. You have some information that's physically withheld from you. Again, whether that's a lack of access because of distance, it could be a lack of access because somebody's stopping you from getting that information. It could be a lack of whatever, anything like that. Or you have the opposite, which is information that you have easy access to, but you don't necessarily know what to do with it just because you have it. It requires some sort of guidance in figuring that out. And so it's interesting that we have the response to one of them, the response to distance. The next word is ma shehaya, that which was. But ma actually means what was. Ma shehaya, ma what was, what is distant. And in regards to depth, we have mi yimsenu, who can find it. So it's almost like there's a what question over here and there's a who question over here. Just kind of hold that for a second, because I think that itself is interesting. We have to figure out what these things are. What is he referring to that's distant? What is he referring to that's deep? And Rashi actually over here, Rashi is the king of commentaries, so to speak, and he tells us that the mashahaya, which is a phrase we've had a lot in the book so far, is referring to the acts of that which was historically. He specifically says the acts of creation. So when we look at the acts of creation, that's something that is distant from us. Or I would say specifically, we're talking about objective fact and information. All right, we're talking about history. This happened, right? Or that is. It's haya. I think that term, that word haya, kind of denotes something that's physically tangible. But a lot of that information, if you want to find all that information, it could tend to be rachok. It could tend to be distant from you. You're just lacking the information, the knowledge it takes to figure out all that stuff. Things that are objective knowledge, your issue is usually going to be an issue of access. Right. When when you're dealing with things that are physical fact, evidence-based, etc., if you lack the knowledge, it's usually an issue of distance. You lack the access to that information, as opposed to something that's deep. So depths, when we talk about something that's deep, I think what he is referring to is something that's a little more on the subjective scale. All right, something that's deep is something that it's inside, or it depends on who you are, is how you're going to look at something that's subjective. And so when we have something that's subjective, which I believe is what he's referring to when he talks about the amok, the very deep stuff, the things that are very deep, there he replies to us and he says, the issue there is mi yimsadu, is you're looking for a who. So when you're dealing with objective fact, you're looking for what. You're looking to try and find out what is. When you're looking for subjective information, which is a lot of our wisdom, the question always comes up is who. Who are you understanding this from? Whose point of view are you getting? There's no specific location of expertise when it comes to subjective, right? If we say, I want to, again, I brought up this case last week, is I gave a class before Passover on the idea of freedom. And so freedom is not necessarily an objective thing. It's not necessarily a objective feeling. It's a subjective feeling. That makes more sense. Yeah. Freedom is something that you feel. You feel free. You experience to a certain degree levels of freedom. One of the things that I found interesting, because it ties directly into this, is that there was a study that was done, and whether Americans felt freer. This is in 2019. So this is before COVID, before any of that sort of stuff. And there were, they were testing people based on demographics and all that sort of stuff. So it was comparing the late 2010s, which would be the Trump presidency, versus the early 2010s, which would be the Obama presidency. Now, I'm avoiding all sorts of politics. We don't try to get into that at all. But one of the questions was to Black communities is, did they feel more or less free? And what they found was that in general, there was a higher level of freedom felt under Obama for Black communities. Now, it wasn't necessarily explaining why or that is or isn't, but it's just interesting to note that when they saw, they did identify that one of the reasons why they felt that was because when they saw a Black person in office, it gave them a sense of freedom in general, as opposed to any other president. So it was just an interesting thing, because so freedom, that goes to show that freedom is a subjective thing. You either feel free, you don't feel free. Sometimes the freest person could actually be what we would consider objectively to be less free. Yeah, I just heard an interview somewhere about somebody who was saying that the fact that they went to jail saved their life, because they went to jail and were able to kick their habits and etc. And then you have other people who say the opposite. So again, these are subjective things, and that's always going to be a question of me, of who is going to tell you. When you have something that's super deep like that, that's subjective, it's inside, it's how you feel, it's how somebody else feels, who is going to tell you what's the truth? Okay, so when it comes to something that's distant, when it comes to objective fact, when it comes to objective wisdom, there's an answerable question, I guess. Masha haya, that which was, is distant, but you can get that access. There's a way to access it if you figure that out. It's a game. You have to figure out how to get that access, but there's a way to do it. As opposed to subjective wisdom, which is still wisdom, but subjective wisdom, you're always stuck with that question of who's going to tell you what's right or wrong, right? Who's going to tell you that this is just the truth of the matter? It's kind of interesting that now one of the phrases that comes up now a lot in like, I mean, when I went to college, when I went to school, this was already a phrase that was showing up, is people talk about speaking or living your truth, right? Well, you living your experience in life. So the problem with using a term like truth is that, truth should be objective, but they're looking at truth as a subjective thing also, which is, debatable. All these things are going to be debatable, but people look at their experiences and they say, this is my truth. And at the end of the day, he's telling us that when it comes to subjective information, it's all going to be a question of who's saying it, who's feeling it, who's experiencing it. And really it comes up to a question of you. What do you find to be subjectively true to you? And that, again, a wise person will reconsider that constantly throughout their life, as we've seen in the last verses. This is an interesting verse over here because it does have this contrast between distance and depth. So to kind of address Jacob's question from last week, distance seems to be an important idea over here. When King Solomon did not understand the idea of the red heifer, it was a lack of access. God did not allow him or any of us to understand that law. It's beyond human understanding, except for Moses, who was given it as a gift. Now, the fact that you see that Moses was given it as a gift, again, this is all in the terminology of the sages, The fact that he was given as a gift shows you that it's something that it's an access question. So it is rachok, it's rachoka, right? In that last verse, I said I would be wise, here rachoka mimeni, and it's distant from me. So it is a question of access, it's a question of distance, as opposed to many other forms of wisdom. Or if we want to figure out what is freedom, so then we're going to be stuck with me and Sanu. Who's going to answer that question for you? Are you going to go with Aristotle's explanation of freedom, or are you going to go with Plato's explanation, or Cicero? There's all sorts of different ideas of what freedom is. So that's going to be a question of who, and it's going to, at the end of the day, again, it's going to be up to you to decide what fits with you, what matches your brain, I guess, is really the question. So that's verse number 2.
Question.
Yeah.
Chok are rules for which we don't necessarily have an explanation, but I think that's a different root, isn't it? Like from
yes, yeah, that is different.
Not related, right?
Yeah, it is not related. Even though it's interesting that they do share letters. I can't imagine there. Well, here's the thing with Hebrew. If we understand that it's a God-given language, so there's going to be some connection there in some spiritual sense. But from a linguistic perspective, there's no relationship. The shoresh, the root over here, is resh chaf kuf, resh chet kuf, which is rachak. Chok would be chet vav kuf, which is actually that word that the root of chok would be something that is etched, like etched in stone. That's the idea. It's a chok is something that's etched in stone. You can't do anything about it. There's no explanation. It just is.
Yeah, but the explanation is distant from us in the way that, the red heifer is distant from us.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a spiritual connection there, but linguistically there's no connection. So.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so with that, let's move on to verse number 25, which is going to start us off on a little, not a different thing, but it's moving us on to step 2. So I would say verses number 21 through 24 in the chapter, we're really all setting up this idea that how we're working on accessing wisdom. We're trying to figure out how to do that. We gotta realize that there's a lot of information that comes to you that you accept because of the source that you get it from. You yourself can make mistakes. Definitely the people that you trust can make mistakes. You don't want to look to somebody who's acting too righteous. You don't want to be somebody who's holier than thou. You don't want to be somebody who's more wicked than what's going on around you. So this was all a big buildup to say, wow, we're stuck. Where do we find wisdom? And King Solomon is kind of lamenting the fact that there's so much wisdom that is subjective, and you're not going to be able to find something. So what does he do? Now we're talking about the wise guy, right? We're talking about King Solomon himself. What is he going to do in his search for wisdom? So he's going to, in verse number 25 here, he's going to take us back into the method that he uses. Now, if you recall, this is very similar to what he said all the way back in the end of chapter 1, where there he talked about the method of understanding happiness. He's going to explain to us again another time about what is his method for understanding wisdom. Okay, so now that he's established this fact that you're not going to find one source of wisdom who is the source of everything. So what's he going to do? What is the wisest of all people going to do in searching for wisdom? All right, that's what he says over here. Saboti ani v'libi. I have turned around myself and my heart. Saboti means I turned around. For example, on Hanukkah, which is coming up, we're going to play the dreidel. People play with the dreidel, or it's called in Hebrew sivivon, right? It spins around. So that's the same root over here. Saboti, I turned myself around. Ani, myself, v'libi, and my heart. So saboti ani v'libi, I turned myself and my heart around. And now he divides this into 2 parts. Ladat v'latur, to know, to inspect, uvakesh, and to request. Chachma v'cheshbon, wisdom and calculation. Viladat, and also to know resha, wickedness, kesel, foolishness, v'hasichlut, stupidity, holelut, and craziness, insanity. Okay, so we've got the verses divided into two parts, or I guess kind of three parts. The first is the intro over here, these first three words, sabutiani v'libi, I turn myself and my heart around. Number one is ladat, is to know. That ladat is kind of a section header. Ladat, latur uvakesh, to know, inspect, and request. Chachma v'cheshbon, wisdom and knowledge. Request could also be seek out. Seek out wisdom and calculation. V'ladat resha kesel v'asichlut holilut, and also to know wickedness, foolishness, stupidity, and insanity, or craziness, Okay, so it seems to be that he's got two groups over here, both separated or capped with this ladat, to know. So that's, first of all, just when we're dividing up the verse, that's going to help us. That ladat, there's one here and one here. And one seems to be indicating a first thing that we're going to do, and one's indicating a second thing that we're going to do. But first, I want to talk about this over here, this intro three words, sabutiani v'libi, I'm turning myself and my heart around. We had heart come up a lot also earlier in the book. The heart seems to be what he does, what he uses for objective reasoning, as opposed to the eyes, which are tricked by things that you see. The heart is the objective, is not going to be swayed by the things that it sees. So he kind of differentiates between himself and his heart, which I guess himself would be more his the things that are the biased aspects of himself, the things that are hoping for certain outcomes, and the heart would be something that's distant from that. Okay, so ani v'libi would be with my biases and without my biases. But what he's doing is he's turning himself around, and that's an important point, because he's come to this conclusion. He's come to this understanding that I'm lacking tremendous gaps in my ability to access knowledge. Right? Whether that's again, as we said in the last verse, whether that's a physical inability, that's a lack of access, or whether that's because I lack the tools, but I do lack something. In either case, I lack something in order to access knowledge. So what I've got to do is now turn myself around. I'm going to have to work backwards, or I'm going to have to at least reevaluate. And again, that's an important point, is that one of the things we consistently see throughout the book is he doesn't just throw things out there. Rather what he does is he inspects and he tests theories. And so that's what he's going to be doing over here, is he's saying, I need to look into this properly and reevaluate everything that I know. And try to figure out, I guess, what's subjective, what's objective, where I define wisdom, where I do not define wisdom. Those are going to be important things to know. Okay? And in the first category,
Can you say again the distinction between ani v'libi and the things that he's turning around? Just, I think I missed that.
Yeah, the way if I remember correctly, we discussed libi a lot. This was again back in the second chapter. Libi seems to be the objective reasoning that a person goes through, that he uses when he talks about inspecting information, inspecting knowledge. Again, earlier he was talking about happiness. So when he does that, when he refers to libi, it's something he's trying to be objective. He's trying to avoid being tempted by his bias, as opposed to the ani, the myself. That would be more something where he's identifying where he has bias, where he wants a certain outcome to come about. When we are dealing with trying to access knowledge and information, we tend to throw ourselves and our interests into that. So I think that's what he wants to do, is he's going to turn himself and his heart around, meaning first he's going to have to identify what are my own personal, where's my bias, where do I want to see certain outcomes, and then also to turn myself around and try to see where can I be objective about what I'm seeing and understanding.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay. And so when it comes to the first category, which is wisdom and calculation, he has three terms. Ladat, number one is to know. That seems to be just a general understanding, coming to understanding of something. When you have the information, you're able to process it. That's Ladat. Latur, we had this long time ago, beginning of the second chapter. We had the same root show up. Tar means literally, well, I can't say literally. Latur is to try and inspect something as objectively as possible. Okay, so again, he's harping on this point of trying to understand things objectively as much as possible. Bakesh means to request or to seek something out. When you are seeking something out, then you're relying on other sources. I would say Latur is to come up to your own conclusions, and Bakesh is to go and seek out the knowledge of others or other sources of information to help you out. So I would say that these two terms, Latur and Bakesh, one is to go and do your own personal inspection, your own personal inquiry, and Bakesh means to ask others or look into other sources for help when trying to understand something. Okay. As a side point, Latur also means to spy. Like when the spies were sent to spy out the land of Israel, the beginning of the 40 years in the desert, which is why they ended up there for 40 years. So the action ever refers to them as usually in Hebrew we refer to them as the Meraglim, but that term is actually never used in the Torah. It's not used in the Chumash itself, in the Bible itself. It actually says Latur. Also there they went to spy out the land. So it's almost like a under the table type of inquiry, as opposed to Bikush, which is where you go and ask someone. You're upfront about it. So kind of another sense of these two words is he's trying to come at information, come at knowledge from two different directions. Number one is kind of a subversive way to spy it out, and the other way is to ask, is to be upfront about it. And what's he trying to do that with? The subject matter is chachma, is wisdom, and cheshbon and calculatedness, calculation, right? Which is interesting that he lumps the two together. A lot of the commentaries understand cheshbon as being the ability to take information and process it and learn something new, as opposed to chachma would just be to know the raw information. Cheshbon would be to take that information and derive and determine new outcomes because of that information. Okay, we're going to go on time, so let me finish the verse, and we'll probably come back to it next week. The second half of the verse is the second project he's got to work on, which is whenever you're trying to understand something, you need to know also the opposite. You need to know what's the negative of that. So that's ladat, to know, resha, wickedness, kesel, foolishness, sichlut is stupidity, and holilut is insanity. I think there's kind of a sandwiching going on over here. Resha is breaking societal standards, right? When a person goes against what society determines to be righteous or not righteous, that person would be a resha, would fall in the category of resha, would be a wicked person. Holy lot, which is insanity, is where somebody breaks societal norms, not necessarily wickedly, but where they do it, they go against what people deem to be normal. So they are now in the category of holel, of crazy, which it's hard to use those words because they carry a lot of baggage. But I think that's just interesting. I think that's what we're trying to do over here is Rasha kind of corresponds to Holy Lut. They're both in regards to how you interact with the society around you. Rasha being acting wickedly in a moral sense. Holy Lut would mean acting against norms in a societal norm sense. And then in the center you have Kesel, which is foolishness. We've talked about Kesel a lot. It's kind of where the person's ears are clogged, right? Kesel is used in other places in Tanakh to indicate something that's blocked up. Okay, so a Kesel is somebody who refuses to be impressed by wisdom, or somebody, something, a group that foolishness is identified as unwilling to be impressed by wisdom, as opposed to sichlut, which is stupidity, right? Is a physical inability to come to wisdom, to come to appropriate conclusions. So on one hand, you have kind of maybe it's these first two are kind of more sinister. You got Resha, which is a sinister, you're going against the morals of society, and Kessel, which is where you refuse to be influenced by wisdom, as opposed to Sichlut and Holilut is stupidity. It's a person's unable to come to those conclusions, to the right conclusions, come to wisdom, and a person is goes against the cultural norms, again, perhaps not as sinister as those first two. So these are the things he's going to have to understand to get a better understanding of wisdom as a whole. All right, we are over time, so I'm not going to, maybe we'll probably come back to this next week. Let's go back to the main session here. All right. Thank you very much for joining us. Some difficult verses over here, I would say, kind of difficult this week, but very interesting. And he's starting to move on to, I think, the part two of this point that he's been kind of building up to. So thank you all for joining.